people tend to really underestimate how much litigation is decided by resources, and they overestimate how much litigation is decided by justice. If Hasbro were to sue Autark, let's say, it would cost $500,000 for Autark to get to summary judgment in that case. And I'm 99% certain that Autark would win summary judgment. I'm 5% certain that I could get $500,000 to get there. And so from the point of view of a litigious Fortune 500 company, what the contract says doesn't matter nearly as much. But I think their core plan of all new content under the new license, the new license will favor us better than the old license did. And over time, we expect all the creators to migrate to this new license. I don't think that core plan has changed at all. So they've just put a velvet glove over the steel fist.
Hello and welcome to Culturescape, the show that interviews the geek creators and influencers that built modern nerd culture. Today we are talking about the biggest nerd debacle I think I have ever seen in my lifetime. We are talking about Dungeons & Dragons and the epic OGL blowup, in which owner of D&D, Wizards of the Coast, put together an insanely bad contract and managed to destroy their fanbase and somehow strengthen their competitors. To discuss that subject and role-playing in general, I have with me Alex Macris, creator and writer for, you may know him of the Ascendant RPG tabletop series, as well as the Adventurer, Conqueror, King series of games, which is also built on the original OGL. We previously talked with Alex about his career in creating the website The Escapist, and he's such an interesting guy that we just didn't get the chance to jump into his work in tabletop RPGs, but somehow Wizards of the Coast managed to find a way, and so we will talk about that here today. Thank you, Alex, for coming on the program.
Hey, thanks for having me back. Great to be here.
Help explain to us, because a lot of this might seem a little up in the air if you're not familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, which of course is the epically popular role-playing series. When you think of tabletop RPGs, fantasy, that's usually what you're thinking of. You want to break us into what the OGL was and what happened here?
Yeah, so in the mid-1990s, TSR, Tactical Studies Rules, had established a dominant position in the tabletop game space with its Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game. And it was fairly litigious at that time. It sued Mayfair Games and Iron Crown, among others, on claims that it had a copyright over certain game rules that they emulated to make the game compatible. When TSR went bankrupt, it was purchased by Wizards of the Coast, and Ryan Dancy, who was at that time a senior vice president for Wizards of the Coast, made the move to put the Dungeons & Dragons rules under an open source license, which he called the Open Game License. And his idea was that role-playing games benefit from network effects, where the value of a game is increased by the square of the number of people you can play it with. And that by making Dungeons & Dragons the default open standard for the industry, he would catapult Wizards to success. And he was right, 100% correct. And the open game license saw the rise of 3rd edition D&D, which was a tremendous success. When they switched to 4th edition, for various reasons, they moved away from the open game license. 4th edition flopped, and we saw the rise of Pathfinder using the open game license. And so for 5th edition, Wizards went back to the open game license. And once again, the open game license was a tremendous boon. They got massive third-party support. 5th edition became the game that everyone plays. Now, in the most recent updates, not the most recent, let's say in the update that started all of this madness, they announced that they were going to be moving away from the OGL in favor of what was called OGL 1.1. It's now being called OGL 2. But the license that they proposed was not at all the open license. Under the original OGL, you could do whatever you wanted with the mechanics that were put under the SRD, System Reference Document. There were no royalties, there were no reporting requirements, there was no ownership transfer, and it was a perpetual worldwide royalty-free license to do whatever you wanted. The new license they were proposing had none of that. In fact, it had some very pernicious provisions, including royalty payments based on gross revenue, regardless of profit, clawbacks of the right to use your work perpetually and irrevocably worldwide, while they had the right to terminate the license on you. A number of other things, as well as somewhat frightening language that might have implicated people trying to sell miniatures or do videos or other factors. So the community, with justification, reacted with outrage to that. And the final stone was when they declared that the old open game license was going to be deauthorized, which was the equivalent of Sun Microsystems announcing that Java is no longer open source. Now you owe us royalties for every Java product. It was crazy. Now they've since backtracked on that, and that's interesting that they backtracked. But I think they've really shattered the trust of the gaming community at this point. I don't see a lot of people at this point really excited to forgive them and return to the fold. But consumer memories are short, so I think they're counting on the shortness of that and a few other factors, which I could go into.
So yeah, the original OGL, my understanding was the idea was D&D, among other things, what it is it's a series of rules that you can build a game on. And they're like, okay, if other people want to refer back to our work or they want to use our rules, here you go. And then that would mean you have all these other tabletop games and systems that come up that refer back. Theoretically, that might help Wizards, or well, now Wizards, sales with D&D, but it would also help grow the interest of people that might be into tabletop. Because I was playing tabletop in 2000. I mean, I was a lot younger, obviously, but I mean, yeah, it's gotten a lot bigger. It really hit mainstream in the last decade. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I think that strategy completely worked, which is why I think it was so shocking to people when they said, oh, by the way, yeah, all that stuff that we said, you could have this in perpetuity, make whatever you want, we don't care. Yeah, that's changed now. Oh, and by the way, you owe us 25% if you make any money on this. Oh, and by the way, we may or may not just grab your creation, just because we want to, just for whatever reason.
Yeah, it was grotesque. It was a perfidious treachery on the part of Wizards of the Coast, as I said in my Substack.
Yeah, and it's that's really what perked my interest, because I think the way you described it. So kind of give people an idea of what goes into making. I don't think people really understand the amount of work that takes to make something like the RPG series that you've worked on.
Well, yeah, sure. So, the good news is that role-playing game writing will probably not be overtaken by AI anytime soon. The bad news is that it's because role-playing game writing is incredibly difficult, time-consuming, research-intensive, and low-paid. So it's about the last place that AI is going to focus on. As an example, Acts 2 is currently 232,000 words, and that's largely technical language that has to be very precisely written with almost a lawyerly attention, but at the same time has to be sprinkled with enough flavorful fluff to keep the reader entertained. And it also has to be presented in a coherent manner where someone who's never played your game before can pick up your book, read it, and understand what you're talking about. And the combination of accessibility to new users plus fluff plus technical writing is really hard. A lot of game designers at this point don't even bother with trying to make it very accessible to new people. They just assume you already know how to play. And often they don't really bother with particularly tight rules. They just assume the judge or the game master will work it all out. But for those who do try to hit all three, it's an exceptionally tough field to craft your work in. The writing is slow and painful. So having the ability to turn to the open game license as the basis for a game, and to use the system reference documents that it incorporated, was a huge boon. It's the difference between inventing the car and building a kit car that you can order the parts. And both require a level of mechanical skill, but the former is far more difficult than the latter.
And it seems to get a lot of the busy work, essentially, or a lot of what is necessary to really get the thing going. And so they did
Well,
that.
reinventing the wheel literally is what you
Yeah.
do. And frustratingly so, because U.S. copyright law doesn't protect game mechanics, but nevertheless, they do get litigated often. And so you run the risk of being, assailed by Wizards or Hasbro or some other well-funded company, asserting that your game violates their copyrights. And even if the law is on your side, which usually is, because again, the law does not protect the copyright game mechanics, even if the law is on your side, it's not like the typical indie game studio has the funds to have a litigation with Hasbro. So the open game license created this safe harbor where everybody felt like we can all use this proven set of rules. It's been play tested, it's well loved. No one's going to get sued. We all know what we have to do. We all know where the limits are, and it was the perfect sort of example of the old legal maxim that the proper role of regulation is to allow business and consumers to flourish, and that was exactly what we were seeing. But all that's been thrown away now.
One of the great points you made that I think a lot of other people, even like people who are associated with like some of the bigger alternatives that like Paizo, for example, you made this point that, look, I used to be a lawyer, which I think we brought up in our last interview. It's look, there's a reality here, guys. It's not just that this is a big, thick legal document that looks really scary. It's that this is a very big company that looks very scary.
Yes.
And it's less about what's in the contract, and it's more what it enables the lawyers to do. Is that about what you're trying to say?
Yeah, I think people tend to really underestimate how much litigation is decided by resources, and they overestimate how much litigation is decided by justice. If Hasbro were to sue Autark, let's say, it would cost $500,000 for Autark to get to summary judgment in that case. And I'm 99% certain that Autark would win summary judgment. I'm 5% certain that I could get $500,000 to get there. And so from the point of view of a litigious Fortune 500 company, what the contract says doesn't matter nearly as much. Justice really comes into play only when it's two well-funded companies fighting it out. Now, Paizo probably does have the funds to fight and is the main person who could combat this. And they seem inclined to do so, which was good news for gamers. But I don't know of any other company in the space that could afford it. Maybe some of the big board game publishers, but they'd be unlikely to be attacked anyway.
So the new OGL, to give people an understanding of kind of what a change was, the original OGL was like 900 words or something. It was less than 1,000.
Yeah.
And this new this new document was 10 times that.
Yes. Yeah.
So what was the reaction from the community, and how have we somehow turned the head of Wizards of the Coast, by the way, who they never turn away from a really bad idea, having been a Magic Gathering fan for a while, I can tell you.
Well, I think Wizards of the Coast thought was as follows. Most of them are old Microsoft executives, and the entirety of the Microsoft business model is built on own the platform, lock them in, profit. And I think they felt that they had lock-in on the tabletop RPG space, and now it was time for the profit step. And so the idea was wipe out the competitors and monetize the users. As it turns out, what they discovered was that they didn't have lock-in. People were willing to switch from D&D to another game system in a way that they aren't willing necessarily, say, to switch from Windows to Macintosh or vice versa. Because they didn't have lock-in, their attempt fumbled. And so now they are having to revisit what they intend to do. And today they released a new statement that backtracked on 95% of the most pernicious terms in the prior license. And if they had come forward with these terms up front, probably a little controversy would have been avoided. But they strategically misjudged the situation, and they thought they were controlling a lock-in monopoly that they could endlessly exploit, and they're not.
Something seems like there is a disconnect, at least the leadership of Wizards And maybe that's because the president currently is a former person from Microsoft and from the gaming sector. What was Wizards' misunderstanding about monetizing tabletop? Because it feels like they thought there was more money going through the system than they're, being a poor tabletop player at times. Really, there is.
I think they're not wrong that there's more money pouring through the system. If you look at how much people are willing to spend on Games Workshop or Magic the Gathering, there's no theoretical reason why the average D&D player might not be willing to spend that much on D&D over time, or at least some percentage of them would become big whales and spend a lot of money. So they're not wrong in that regard. Where they went wrong, I think, was in assuming that consumer behavior wouldn't change if there was a viable alternative. And let me explain what I mean. If you've already got a ton of Magic cards and a new game comes out that's really fun and a lot like Magic, but you're not going to switch because you've already spent a ton of money on Magic cards. With Dungeons & Dragons, they said, look, our player base is just as loyal as Magic, so therefore we can exploit that player base and monetize it. But the problem is that the D&D players haven't got that huge Magic collection that becomes useless to them. They can switch. So the cost of switching is much lower for a tabletop game than for the other products that they were comparing it to, I think is where they erred. And so because that switching cost was low, a lot of companies like Paizo, like myself, a bunch of others have all said, we're switching, and a bunch of gamers have said, we're switching. And the signal that hit them loud and clear was people turning off their D&D Beyond subscriptions in thousands and thousands and thousands. That hit them loud and clear that, hey, people really will turn off and away from us if we pursue this path.
There were a number of leaks. The only thing that would really bother them is if it hurt their bottom line. Do you think that's true? Because that all that stuff that also came with a warning that this is just something Wizards expects to blow over. Like they're just hoping till people forget, and then they're going to pick back up the axe.
Yeah. So, well, first I think it's important to remember that Wizards isn't a person. Wizards is a collection of people, and when I say they, or speak of Wizards, I specifically mean the executive management team as well as the president of Hasbro, his chief of staff, and their general counsel. That's they. It isn't, Mike Rules or the cover artist. Those people do care about the players. They do care about the game. And they're by and large overworked and underpaid. There aren't tabletop game designers working for Wizards or getting rich. They're not doing it to monetize the players and make big bucks. So I think there was a disconnect internally between how the team felt and how the executives felt. And, that's not uncommon in the video game space. You see that all the time, indie development studio and publisher, where the publisher's view of the players is totally different than the indie developers. So let's be clear that the villains here are not the line workers at Wizards of the Coast. The villains are the executives who do, in fact, consider the player base to be cash cows and essentially, they're to be milked, and let's get started on the udders.
It's something about what's changed in D&D, the culture, and role playing, the audience base. I think what we're seeing, especially right before COVID, I think around 2015, I started seeing it. People who previously had no interest in anything that got even within, a mile of tabletop RPGs, none whatsoever. But we had things that became more popular, like Critical Role. That's a big one. And so there were new types of people coming in. It's part of this, like, they don't really understand the new players that came in, and so they were thinking that they could treat these people just like their older base.
No, I don't think that's what it was, because I think most of the outrage actually came from poor gamers than from the casuals. I think the casuals and the new players, for the most part, it's only slightly reached them. I think the real upset came from the third parties that produce in the space and make their living in the space, and those are by definition fairly hardcore people. I think looking at the new audience, what they look at is they're like, look, this is an audience that'll pay $5 a month for a subscription for an online game, or they'll drop $20 in their favorite MMO to buy a new skin that they want. Like, there's this digital goods consumption culture and this subscription culture within gaming circles that has turned out to be hugely lucrative. And so I have a good friend who works for one of the top game development studios. And I asked him what it was like to be a game developer nowadays for a video game company. And he said it sucks because of the rise of micropayments. Whereas before, when you designed a game, your job was to make the game as fun as possible so that people would love to play it and buy your next game. And he said, and now your job is to addict them to spend money on your game. And the former was something he really enjoyed doing, and the latter he hates. The latter is now what every video game company does. It's all about, how do I monetize my player into spending money on microtransactions? So all free-to-play model, etc. Yeah. Wizards is simply adopting that mindset for tabletop games.
But it doesn't work exactly because, I mean, they're very similar. And video games, obviously, much of that is built kind of on some of the work that D&D did. But they're two different things with like you said, the core can be a lot more different than I think that Wizards realize. All this makes me wonder, like how in touch is Wizards of the Coast with people that are interested in tabletop RPGs?
Oh, I don't think that this was due to lack of being in touch. I would stake my life on the fact that they were told loud and clear by their PR team and everyone else that this was going to upset a lot of people. I know the PR lead at Wizards of the Coast, his name is Greg Tito. He used to work for The Escapist, and he co-wrote Axe with me. And Greg and I had our falling out on various issues, but he is a man of the highest integrity, and he is a man who has a very strong will, and he is very in touch with the D&D community. And I mean, I can't imagine any circumstance where he let this go forward, didn't raise the red flag, for instance. I mean, it's just impossible to think otherwise. So, no, I think this was a very deliberate. This was not an action taken out of ignorance. This was a very deliberate step. And I think they made a calculus. We're going to lose X. X is worth Y, but we're going to earn Z, which is greater than Y. So therefore, this is fine. And what happened was that because of the consumer and business activism, X became larger than they expected. And so now they're retrenching to figure out how they get to Z. They still want to get Z, and they're still willing to lose X. They're just not willing to lose Y.
Which it seems like they are losing, at least temporarily.
At least temporarily, right. That's right.
So when you look at your business partners and the people that work on the projects like you do, what are you guys saying to each other? Do you it's time to get out, just push away, just get off the OGL and anything to do with Wizards? Are people warming back up to maybe they shouldn't be so rushed to judgment because Wizards seems to be walking some of this back? What do you think? And then what are you hearing from people around you?
Yeah, I think people are still processing today's release, where they rolled back most of the provisions that had concerned everyone. I'm not seeing a whole lot of forgiveness. I'm seeing a lot of mistrust still. There's a certain exaltation that the consumer activism led to some victory, some pushback of the terms, and I think that's merited, and I participated in that. That said, I think that Wizards' plans remain the same, and so what I expect is that the prior license will remain authorized, so they won't deauthorize the old open game license for old products. They will ask that you use the open game license, their new license for new products supporting their 6th edition, or D&D 1. And what I expect they will do is they will subtly but methodically make the new edition of the game much less compatible with the old edition of the game, so that if you want to keep supporting it and keep playing it, you have to be using the new license. And they will more gradually transition than they had planned, and they will suck it up as a loss if there's a certain amount of competition that's going to continue in the space that they had hoped not to have. But I think their core plan of all new content under the new license, the new license will favor us better than the old license did. And over time, we expect all the creators to migrate to this new license. I don't think that core plan has changed at all. So they've just put a velvet glove over the steel fists.
And so it sounds like Wizards, they still want frog soup. They're like, we just cooked the frog too quickly this time.
That's correct. That's exactly correct. They cook the frog too quick. Yeah. So put it back in the pot and turn it on a simmer instead of a boil.
It's such a crazy time to be interested in role playing. It's like I never, even 10 years ago, I never thought it would be almost mainstream popular, and that's really cool. Overall, I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Since you did train as a lawyer, I wanted to hear what you thought about this there. And a couple people put this forward. Probably the largest one is Legal Eagle. It essentially says what a lot of this did was a lot of these companies like Paizo made them look back at the original terms of OGL and why it seemed useful. And the theory they put forth is that people who were making RPGs like you may have not needed the OGL to begin with because the rules are not copyrightable. So you can copy rules and just put them in your own game. You don't need to credit Wizards of the Coast whatsoever. Is that true? Was the original OGL just like a way to get some control instead of no control? And I'm sure if that's the case, Wizards is deeply regretting the situation they're in.
I don't think so, no. It is true that game mechanics are not copyrighted, but the expression of game mechanics can absolutely be copyrighted. And so knowing that the game is resolved with a roll of a 20-sided die plus a skill plus an attribute modifier, that's fine. You can't copyright that. The language you use, the name of the attribute, the name of the skill, how you reference everything, that can all be copyrighted, and it was copyrighted. And companies used to litigate with each other when they thought that people had gotten too close to their turf. So there was a real risk to indie developers who wanted to do games that were compatible with Dungeons and Dragons. There was a real risk of being sued. And again, in order to determine whether or not you were exempt because it was rules and not expression of rules required a lawsuit. And that lawsuit was going to take $500,000 just to get to summary judgment. So it didn't matter because most of them could never do that. So the way I think about it is I want you to think of the law as nuclear weapons. Okay. So the United Nations already says it's a violation of international law to begin a war of aggression on another country. Okay. Like that's international law. You're not allowed to aggress on another country. And yet countries have nuclear weapons with which they can nuke the hell out of each other. And so you could look at that and say, well, who cares? The UN said it's illegal. Or you could do what Reagan and Gorbachev did and sit down and say, we're going to have a strategic arms limitation treaty where we're going to reduce the threat of nuclear weapons by actively pulling our missiles back, making big, clear lines of what would ever cause us to use them, reducing the total number, and then we're therefore going to reduce the chance of nuclear war. And that's what the OGL was, right? It was a strategic arms limitation treaty. It says, look, you can use all of these things and you won't be litigated against. Don't cross this red line and everything will be fine. And everybody signed on to it and it worked. So that's the best I can give as an example of why you would already signed on to it and why the threat of litigation was so worrisome.
So what are you doing now with your company? I know Paizo's, I've now talked about the 3 times this. Now, they are offering their own kind of version of the OG, or, an open gaming platform they could use. What are you planning to do? In your Substack, you said you were just going to move away from it completely and do your own thing. Is that still the plan?
It is. So I've actually been busily scraping through all of my Adventure Conqueror King system to create Adventure Conqueror King System Imperial Imprint, or AX 2. And that's going to be stripped free of all of the system reference document language that I used in the first version, and will be released, using a new license that isn't Wizards of the Coast open game license. At present, my intent is to sign on with Paizo's new work license, provided that it doesn't have a morality clause or some other sort of restrictive provision that limits what creators.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah. If it does, then I'll just make my own license. They're not that hard to create, or I'll routine a lawyer to create one. I do intend to open up my game so that others can support it, or or make supplements for it. So,
Do you think people who are interested in AD after this are going to be more interested in trying alternatives like yours? In a way, could this
I've already seen
for
it.
you?
I've already seen it. My sales quadrupled this month. So,
Thank you, Wizards. What a kind gift.
yeah. Wizards paid my mortgage for 3 months in 1 week. So that was really nice. Thank you, Wizards. Sometimes you have to just be grateful when your enemies make mistakes and just say, thank you so much.
So what do you think people should take away from this, and what do you see on the horizon for your, not just your company, but the community and the industry you work in as a whole?
I think part of it is it's very definitely a be careful what you wish for outcome for nerds, because in the 90s and the early 2000s, we all desperately wanted our hobbies and pastimes to become mainstream. But now that they've become mainstream, they've become subjected to the same forces that made us want to escape from the mainstream in the first place. And so it's a little tragicomic in that point of view. I think an important takeaway for everyone is that we've now reached the stage in late stage capitalism where hating corporations is something you can do from both the left wing and the right wing. We've seen everyone come together as one in a great swelling of hatred for what Hasbro is doing to its brand. And that's been nice to see. It's been nice to see gamers putting aside political differences temporarily to kind of oppose what's happening. And it's a really good reminder that corporations are not people and they're not your friends, and they don't really give a shit. They don't actually care. They have products and they have consumers that they want to monetize. And individual people working for corporations may care, but corporations don't care. And it's, fandom to corporations is just something to be exploited, and you should never be a fan of a corporation.
And as much as you may like a company like Nintendo or Wizards or whoever it is that you're enamored at the moment, while now, your interests are aligned, that will not always be the case.
Correct. That's correct. Because they're immortal, and the people that were there that you liked won't be there for long. Blizzards today is not the Blizzards I knew in the 90s. They're like evil immortal liches. Anyway, in terms of the game space, I think what we're going to see is as follows. I think Wizards is going to backtrack successfully enough that the majority of 5e gamers will migrate to 6e. But it won't be as much as it would have been. So let's say if last time they would have had, if they had handled it better, they would have had a 90% migration. Let's say now they'll have a 75% migration. That 15% loss will hurt them. It will destroy them because they will end up monetizing consumers that transfer over more than they're currently monetizing them. But that 15% of their market share represents an enormous piece of pie to everyone else. And so what's going to happen is everyone from Paizo down to Autark, every company in between is going to be trying to, get a share of that pie. And for Paizo, if they get 5% of the 15%, that's a huge win for them. If I get 0.5% of the 5%, that's an enormous win for me. So I think we're going to see a lot of new game systems come out. We're going to see a lot of new licenses come out. We're going to see a lot more openness in Reddit and Twitter to people saying try games other than Dungeons & Dragons. Whereas during the 5e dominance period, people were like, I'm a D&D player. And now it's going to be more like, I'm a gamer. And they're going to be more open to trying things. So I think it'll be good for a lot of the smaller companies. It's just going to be a lot of work for us to get there because so many of us have to redo so many game designs.
I think that's very optimistic. I also think that's realistic. I think this overall, for people who are interested in tabletop, this will be a positive, because I think you're right. It spreads out the interest, gets more people into it. Kind of reminds me a little bit. This is a little before my time, but the 90s where we had new games spout up, and all of a sudden, the cynical Gen Xers like, oh, I gotta try this vampire D&D. I'm like,
exactly. Yeah. I remember being really excited because Vampire brought hot goth chicks into gaming.
Yeah.
And, when I was 20 years old, that was pretty much about all I could think about. So, I totally love Vampire. Yeah. So,
All right, Alex. Well, hey, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a busy time. I know you feel a little under the weather, so I appreciate you agreeing to the interview and helping make this happen. Is there anything else you want?
It's my pleasure. I think I'm only going to do interviews from now on when I'm sick because my voice sounds deeper.
It gives you that more luxurious, almost smoker.
Yeah, in a world where I have a cold. Yeah. Thanks for having me on the show.
No problem. Anything else you would like to tell my listeners, and where can they find your stuff?
I want to tell them that Adventure Conqueror King System Imperial Imprint, or Acts 2, will be crowdfunding in May and will be available in draft format in February on my Patreon. And my Patreon is patreon.com/autarch, AUTARCH.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Alex. All of you guys should check it out. His games are fantastic, as is he. And until next time, friends, keep geeking out.